Hey there, folks. This is Jay Frost speaking to you from the stage of the Philanthropy Mastermind series. And I'm using that term lightly because we have someone who really knows the stage and screen and beyond, who's going to be talking with you today. But I'm really happy that you can be here to enjoy this along with me. This is a session, of course, on the 5 stages to expanding your fundraising team. But it's being conducted by a person who really knows that from a bunch of different lenses, literal and figurative, and that's Joanne Butcher, who will be joining us on the screen in just a moment. But first, I wanted to welcome you, and of course, to encourage you to be a part of this discussion today, because since she will be sharing a lot of knowledge with you directly to you, that means that since she can't hear your voices or see your faces, I hope you will freely and frequently use the chat and the Q&A. Both as a sandbox for your own discussion, but also to penetrate this discussion and ask questions and give comments. It's really a great space to do that. In fact, if you don't mind, we'll just warm that up right now and invite you to just in the chat maybe say where you're from, maybe which organization you're with, maybe even what you do. But whatever you'd like to do, it'd be wonderful to just see that there so that our presenter today will have a sense about who's in the audience and what your needs and interests are. So please do just open up the chat if you would and say hello. And while we're doing that, I also want to thank our sponsor of this series, which is, of course, DonorSearch. We won't be talking about DonorSearch today unless our guest chooses to mention them for some reason, but that's not through any lack of affection. We have deep appreciation both for what they do in the sector in terms of bringing the top technology and insights to fundraising, especially knowing who our donors are now and in the future, using especially things like AI in a really powerful way, but also because they provided this platform for discussions in the Philanthropy Mastermind series going back to 2016. So there are now, I finally counted it, 527 sessions in this series that you can listen to many of either on your favorite podcasting platforms or over on the DonorSearch site at donorsearch.net under the resources tab. And when you're doing all that, maybe learn a little bit more about your donors too through DonorSearch, but I'll let you check that out there. Now, oh, and I see you all really took me seriously. Thank you so much. I can see a whole bunch of faces here. Chris and Jessica, Tammy. Oh, wow, this is great. Jean, Art, Eric, Mary, Sarah. Oh, I appreciate you all so much. Thank you for doing this. And I know that Joanne will appreciate it as well as she jumps into this topic. It's really great to see both where you're from and what you do. That will help a lot as she discusses this topic with you. So with that, I want to welcome Joanne to unmute and show us herself, do the big reveal, and maybe tell us a little bit about her work. And one of the reasons I'm not giving you her full bio is because if I did, she wouldn't have any time to talk. What I will encourage you to do, and I'm sure we'll provide this in the chat as well, is to give you a link to her website, Filmmaker Success. And if you're a person like me for whom the first love is literature and film, you're really going to like looking at her site, not only for what she brings to the sector as a CFRE who knows fundraising and knows film, but also as a person who's been behind those films. So I really do check out the site after you enjoy the presentation today. Joanne?
Well, thank you so much, Jay. I should have admitted before we started that I'm terrible about following the chat. So, but it's been so fun reading everybody's, where you all are and what you're doing. And it's so great that there's a community of fundraisers here. I feel as though I have very few fundraisers in my life right now because there's hardly anyone doing fundraising in film, which is where I spend most of my time. But fabulous, Michael. It's really great to be amongst a group of fundraisers, and I get to talk about my favorite thing, which is raising money. So I'm going to talk today about the 5 stages to expanding your fundraising team. And I'll tell you some stories that from my fundraising journey. I haven't always been in film, but I did start out fundraising when I first arrived in America from England, and I was at the English department of the University of Miami, and every phone call that came in asking for an English student, I took the job because I hadn't known. And I ended up working for a dance company, and that was the first fundraising that I did. And it started from there, and I kind of worked in the arts, and then I ended up running a cinema. And then I realized that filmmakers really don't know anything about raising money. And I started teaching filmmakers. And along the way, I started to specialize in capital campaigns for the YMCA, for my spiritual home, which is Kashi Ashram in Florida, and youth radio. And for a little while, I flirted with the idea of becoming a planned giving specialist. I think that's a really amazing area of fundraising. And that was actually the same time that I got sick, and I didn't work for 7 years from illness. And when I started to emerge from that, I decided to just focus on film and work there. But now I'm once again consulting with nonprofits and helping fundraise. And the reason that I love this topic about building a fundraising team is because often when I was working in the nonprofit world, I was a one-stop development shop. And so if you're not familiar with that term, although most of you probably are, we were the ones who did all the different types of fundraising. And then once you get past about $3 million, you start having people who specialize in each different area. And so I've always thought about, well, how do you go from having one person to having a team? And it's something that I teach my clients now all the time. And so before I even say anything, I want to begin with what I talk about, the difference between working solo versus working solo with a vision. And I think those are two very different things, because as fundraisers, it's very easy for us to be very tactical. But I think that vision is incredibly valuable. And so I would like you all, and you can write it in the chat if you like, or keep it to yourselves, but I'd like you to think of a couple of things to do with vision. So one is about budget. And so I'd like you to come up with a number that would be a vision for you for what you could raise in 2024. And that might not be what is on the table now that you're going to raise, but what would be a vision that you could raise. And the way I like to think about this is there's the current budget. And that budget might be, I'll just give an example. Well, we can serve 20 people with this budget. But if we really could serve who we would like to serve, it would actually be 30 people. And what would the budget be for that? And I call that the ideal budget. What the vision budget is if we really could do what we want to do. That's the vision budget. And one of the reasons that I believe I have been so successful as a fundraiser is because I always talk about the vision budget. And I find that donors and funders are interested in the vision much more, even than in what I call the ideal budget, which is what we would do if we could do a bit more. I think they're interested in the vision, and I'll talk about that later. So what would be your vision for the budget for 2024? And then what would be the vision for the budget in 5 years? And I'd like you to write down those two numbers. And as I said, if you want to write them in the chat, awesome. And if you want to keep them private, you can do that too. Another thing I would like you to vision is, who would you like to have on your team? Who would you like to add to your team? And what might be your vision for that? Oh, thank you so much, Tammy. The oldest opera house in the state, 2 million to stabilize the building. Oh, I bet that's super important, phase 1. And then a 5-year budget, $10 million for a full restoration. Ooh, now, see, this is what a fabulous example. I am so grateful for that example. So what I would say is that what donors really want to hear is about the full restoration of the building. That's what I would talk about from now on. I wouldn't talk about the 2 million anymore. I would talk about the 5-year budget for the $10 million for the full restoration. And you can just hear the difference in the energy, you know, when you talk about what that vision is. Thank you, Jane. Oh no, Jame. I'm not sure how you say that, and I guess I'm not going to ever find out. But yes, so that you have those two numbers. So next, who would you like to have on your team? So you might want Tammy might want a capital campaign manager. Somebody might want a grant writer. Who would you like to have on your team? And then that's beautiful. I always use the word sexy, Tammy. The sexy ask is what donors really want to hear. So I'd like you to think about who might be a celebrity who you might have involved on your fundraising team. This isn't somebody who would be staff, obviously, but if there's a celebrity who you could imagine would really enhance your fundraising and excite your donors, who might that be? I asked this question recently when I taught this class, and somebody said Gayle King. And I was like, oh my gosh, you know, I don't really know much about Gayle King, but she just seems like a very wonderful, warm person. And I heard, oh yeah, Gayle King would be a great person to have. Zach says Adam Sandler. Oh, well, I'd love to know more about why Adam Sandler. That is a great idea. 500,000 to give close to 2,000 concerts. Yes. And to be able to consistently give those. Ryan Reynolds, he is just the cutest. Hoda Kolb, great. Oh, I see. Yes. Adam Sandler is the local celebrity. That's a very good idea because you can sort of build your events around when he's in town, you know, because I'm sure he's coming home to visit. Stedman Graham. Oh my gosh. I wonder if he is like he's already involved in fundraising a lot, I think, isn't he? Willie Nelson, beautiful. Dolly Parton, yes. Yeah. So again, I'm sort of playing with this idea of vision. You know, vision is a way that we can kind of a phrase I was given years ago is like throw a grappling hook. Like, you know, if I have Stedman Graham as my grappling hook that I can go for, it's motivating, it's inspiring, and it's fun. And so just keep all those things. Don't try and necessarily take that vision and turn it into tactics. Just play with that idea. And I just would argue that it's more fun working solo with a vision than working solo without a vision. So that's my first stage in expanding. It's like we're expanding with this fun vision that we are getting into. So the second stage I have is to diversify your fundraising portfolio. And one of the things that I see with nonprofits is that they tend to get really good at one kind of fundraising or two kinds of fundraising. And so whenever I was a consultant with a nonprofit, I would always look to expand the different types of fundraising. One example, I worked for Youth Radio on a capital campaign. We were raising $5 million. And Youth Radio trains young people to be broadcast journalists. And when I started at the organization, I said, oh, you know, can I see your 990? And I realized that 90% of their income or more was coming from foundations. They were just a foundation darling, and it's to do with youth and education and the creativity of the broadcast journalism plus the journalism thing. But it seemed to me that they were missing some opportunities, the main one being individual donors, and they really had basically no individual donors to speak of. So my first day there, I got hold of all these board retreat reports, and I saw that year after year after year, the board would have a retreat and would say, we really want to raise money from individual donors, but they didn't do it. So I decided to apply for a grant from the Kresge Foundation. I think today that the Kresge Foundation is still my favorite foundation out there. They're very, very, very creative and very innovative. And I had just met them when I was still working at the YMCA, and they had come to the YMCA philanthropy conference, and they had said, you know, we really would like some applications from the Y, but we never get any. And we have a 100-year history of giving to capital campaigns for really blue chip organizations, symphonies, operas, ballets. You'll see Kresge all over 100-year-old buildings in this country. But we shut down for 2 years, and we reemerged with a brand new mandate, which is to fund in urban centers of poverty. So YMCAs are often in those neighborhoods. So I had already raised money from the Kresge Foundation for the YMCA before I moved to Youth Radio. So I applied to Kresge for $1 million, and they said no, but you could ask for less. So I asked for $250,000. We got $250,000. But anytime you get a grant from Kresge, they give the carrot, which is the grant, but they also have a little bit of a stick, which is, and you're required to raise a match from individual donors. And I always see Kresge as giving money to help an organization grow its fundraising capacity. I really feel as though that's fundamentally behind their thinking. So I knew if we got money from Kresge, we'd be required to raise money from individual donors, which is like two stones turned. We got the money, and then after I left Youth Radio, apparently Kresge called the executive director up and said, we'd like to give you some more money. We're going to give you 500,000. She's like, oh, thank you. And then a few months went by, and they said, we'd like to give you some more money. We're going to give you 750,000. And then Youth Radio was required to raise 250,000 from individual donors. So I knew that I was expanding Youth Radio's fundraising from foundations, being 100% foundation centered, to also having individual donors. So I felt that was a victory. So what are the types of fundraising that maybe you are missing that you could add? Maybe one. This may not sound the easiest thing to do, but I believe that the easiest one to add, especially if you are an opera, looking for an opera house, is to add planned giving. And adding a planned giving program can be something that really doesn't cost anything. And I think that nonprofits tend not to do it because they think, oh, we don't have that expertise. But planned giving is something that you can add without having expertise. And when somebody calls to make a planned gift, and they ask questions, you can just refer them to their own accountant or their own estate planning lawyer. So you never have to feel that you have to have all that expertise. But I think it's something that you should definitely consider adding, especially if you're in a brick and mortar building. Tammy says she'd like to add an annual giving program. Well, that's a great thing. So if I were a one-person fundraising, not a team, if I were a solo fundraiser and I wanted to add an annual giving program, then I would start by choosing, that end of year gift, and I would compose a very special letter to donors. Once I was consulting for a senior center, and they had a letter go out every year, annual ask every year. And I looked at their letters and they were and they were terribly boring. And so I interviewed a couple of our seniors, which was pretty easy. They came into lunch every day. They came in for services. They were super fun. And I interviewed a couple of the seniors, and then I wrote a letter and I told their stories. It was just about a paragraph about one person and a paragraph about the other person. We had people raving about that letter, absolutely raving. I mean, board members, seniors, all kinds of people raving about this letter. And all it was that I told two stories about real people. And, you know, everybody loves a story about a real person. So I think that if you are on your own and you want to add another kind of fundraising, I would say an annual giving program could be something as simple as a letter. That question, Tammy, I think I'm not going to go into right now at that level of detail, but I'm just saying, you know, what if you're already working full time, what could you add that maybe you haven't thought to add that wouldn't cost you in terms of time or resources that you could manage? The one thing I wouldn't add would be a special event. Then I'm biased. Once I was working at Miami-Dade Community College and we did about 65 events a year and I got totally burned out. I'm not into special events unless they're house parties. So number 3, stage 3, I'm trying to look at the time. Invest in funding. What can you invest in that you haven't invested in already? And if you want to expand your fundraising team and you make an investment, one of the things I would always notice when I was consulting for various nonprofits, I would look at their 990 and I'd see fundraising, the line item in their budget would be 0. I'd be like, there's just something you could do that could just take your fundraising up a notch. So some suggestions I have would be classes in grant writing, classes in planned giving, because as I said, I think people are always scared by planned giving, but they really don't need to be. The Association for Fundraising Professionals is one place that I would take classes, or your CFRE classes, but here you are, you're taking a class. So if you're not raising money from foundations, you could get a membership for the foundation directory. Now, this is one of my big pet peeves because they keep increasing the prices for the foundation directory. It's now $219 for an individual, more for an organization. And there are other organizations where you can do research on foundations. But my favorite way of raising money at the moment is foundations, and writing like a 2-page letter of intent to foundations with your project and introducing yourself. And you can send out a lot of 2 pages. So invest in fundraising, maybe invest in DonorSearch, you know, but just try and invest in something that's going to expand your fundraising, maybe a fundraising conference, anything that's going to increase your knowledge. And as I said, you're all here. So number 4, stage 4, align with fundraising volunteers. Now, I think that a lot of times people just assume that nobody would be interested in volunteering to fundraise. But I think that a lot of people really are interested in adding fundraising as a skill. And I've had a lot of volunteers over the years. And when I was working for the YMCA in San Francisco, they had been running for 30 years a 6-week fundraising campaign, and it was based on a book. I think it was called The Red Book, and it had been started in LA, the YMCA of LA, and now it's spread to all these different Ys. And so I was introduced to this concept And what it was we had teams of people fundraising over this 6-week period. And it was there was a lot of fun involved. We had an opening event and a closing event and events in between, and everybody got together. You know, the Y is a membership organization, and it was a lot of reasons for people to get together and have fun, and also to get some training and fundraising. So when I first went to work at the Y, they said, oh, you're going to be running a fundraising team. So I was given 8, 9, 10 people. Some of them had already been on teams before and already knew about fundraising. They had already raised money before, and some people were new. And so new people were given a minimum of $600 to raise. And other people who had higher goals that they had raised before. And so I had let's call it 10 people on my team. And then my job was to support them through that 6-week fundraising event. And our team would bring in money. And I had a friend who heard about this, and he said, oh, I want to learn fundraising. So I put him on my team, and I think we set his goal at $3,000. And he ended up winning the prize for the individual who raised the most money in that 6-week fundraising. And an even better part of that story was his husband was very, very, very wealthy. And my friend had said, I want to learn fundraising because we give away about $25,000 a year, but it doesn't really seem quite in keeping with what we have. So he wanted to learn fundraising and bring that to his husband. And ultimately, his husband became the chair of a capital campaign for Project Involve, which was an organization in San Francisco that brought meals to the homes of people with HIV and AIDS, and ran a capital campaign for $30 million or something like that. So I always feel as though I was the one who taught them how to get going with their fundraising. So volunteers could come and work on a particular project like that, or they could come and work for a particular time. I remember one volunteer coming and saying to me, I'll only be able to work for 6 months. She worked for me full time for 6 months. That was also when I was at the Y. So I've put together a lot of teams of fundraisers, very much based on that YMCA experience. I've also put together people who raise money through raffles. And I think nobody thinks of raffles anymore, but it's very, very cool if you have something that's a great prize. So I had this one organization, and somebody gave us 2 tickets to a Madonna concert. And so instead of, selling them or something, we decided to do a raffle. And I got books of raffle tickets, and I ended up with a team of 20 people who sold raffle tickets. And out of those 20 people, there were some people who didn't sell 1 ticket. And maybe I set the rule up at the beginning that if you didn't sell any raffle tickets, you bought your tickets, so they would buy their tickets. And then there were a few people who sold a couple of books of tickets. And then there were a couple of people who sold a ton of raffle tickets. So I picked one of those 2 people and put him in charge of the raffle for the next year. So with fundraising volunteers, really one of the big things that they're getting out of it is they're learning fundraising, and they're also being part of a community. So as the person running those volunteers, it's our job to provide them with education and to provide them with support and a fun time. So I really, really recommend that you look for volunteers. And then the 5th step is to hire help. So ideally, some of these ideas that we've already implemented, trying a new type of fundraising, investing in learning more about fundraising, having some volunteers, maybe now we're in a position to hire. And so that might be hiring somebody part-time at first. It might be hiring somebody in one type of fundraising. So it might be a grant writer, or it might be somebody who specializes in corporate sponsors. That's always the hardest one, I think, to find. And ultimately to hire more full-time people. So that's kind of the final step. But I think that before hiring, there are all these other 4 steps that we can do to build to that place. So those are my 5 steps. And if you have questions, I'd love to hear those. And maybe Jay has some questions or things to talk about.
Sure, and I know we do have questions here tonight. Thank you, Joanne. I know that when people talk about teams, sometimes they're thinking about all the people just on their professional staff. Sometimes they include the body of the organization, like the board, but then sometimes they look beyond, like the volunteers who we're talking about. So there are a lot of ways to define team. And I think some of that was reflected in the questions earlier too. We had a question, I think was earlier, I'm trying to see who that was from. Perhaps it was from Michelle, who had asked about how many people should a full functioning development team have. So again, it's part of this is definition, but can you talk about that maybe in relation to budget? Because when you started and you kicked this off, you talked a little bit about what are you trying to achieve? What's the vision? And then what do you need to achieve it? The team to do it? Can you talk about those ratios a little bit?
Yes. Well, when I was saying I was a one-stop development shop, so I was a full-time person and I was the sole staff person. Well, I suppose the executive director was also responsible for fundraising, but basically it was me. So the budgets for the organizations I was working for would be between $1.5 to $3 million. So my responsibility as that full-time person, I had the responsibility of bringing in $250,000 a year in grants, $250,000 a year from individual donors. And then this was the why that I'm thinking of. So we had a lot of income from memberships. So with different organizations in that kind of range, I would be responsible for more or less of that budget. And then we might have a capital campaign on top as well. So if you have one person doing that, that's a lot, you know, but I'm very good at fundraising.
So when it comes to the campaign, then are you talking about doubling the number of volunteers, or what's been your experience when you try to go into a campaign mode for the number of people that might be required and what kind of roles they might fill?
Well, I think that model that I gave for the YMCA team, I think is great, because asking people to do something for 6 weeks is doable, you know? And so I really learned that. And my boss would always say, you know, you don't really want to be in campaign mode for longer than 6 weeks. You know, as fundraisers, we're kind of in campaign mode all the time. But if you can have these sort of high points and low, it's better. So that's why to the question about the annual campaign, I was saying, well, to start with, at least go for that end of year ask. You know, start there. There are organizations that ask 4 times a year, that ask more than that, but at least start to have that one place, one time of year to ask, so that you're not in go mode all the time.
Yeah, you probably need to pause once in a while. I guess everybody in this room feels that way.
Yes.
We do have a whole bunch of questions here, and I'll just share some of them with you so you don't have to keep going back and forth to the chat if you don't mind. And one came in earlier, and that was from Tammy, who had talked about personal communication, whether personal letters or face-to-face seems to work better for you. And, you know, of course, you talked about relationships, especially with these volunteers. So can you kind of paint a picture about where the that written versus maybe the, you know, that 48 inches apart makes a difference?
Yeah, I think of this as a pyramid. So at the lower end of the pyramid, I didn't even mention crowdfunding, but crowdfunding is really the most common way these days that we use to raise smaller amounts of money from small donors. So the most common amount that's given at a crowdfunding campaign is $50, $75, and $100. And you can have higher gifts. So so you have, you know, maybe several hundred people at the $50 level, and then you have smaller numbers as it goes higher and higher and higher and higher. So if your highest donor is, say, $25,000, then you're going to allocate your time and face-to-face to your $25,000 donor rather than to your $50 donor. So the $50 donor might be approached through crowdfunding or through emails or through letters. And then as you get to higher and higher numbers, one experience I had, I keep talking about the why today, but anyway, we had a board member and she never spoke. She was a Hawaiian Japanese lady and never spoke, came to every single board meeting. And every single board meeting, she baked muffins and brought muffins. And I watched her at the board meeting. She gave $25,000 a year to the Y. And one day I went and met her at the cafe and helped her make her muffins. And I said, you know, would you consider hosting a party for our new board members? She was so excited. And she put on this lovely event at her home, and we invited new board members, and we had a lovely event. So then I said to her, would you consider having a fundraising party at your home? We'll invite donors. Oh, yes. So we had this lovely event. She gave us $1 million. And I am just convinced that all that was noticing somebody, spending some time with them, and enough time to really learn what it was that interested her, you know. And it was never going to interest her to be speaking and talking and anything like that, but she loved to serve, and this was her organization. So you spend the most time with your highest level donors.
I really appreciate that story, and I know everybody in the room does. And just as a note, we have on May 9th a session we just programmed, which will have a number of folks, including some who are originally from Hawaii and have strong ties to the Asian community in the United States. It's a celebration of AAPI funding, because next month is
AAPI.
AAPI Heritage Month. So
yes.
the story you told is I have not heard that story before, but the message in it is something that I understand, and it's very important for all of us to consider. Sometimes it's the silent but involved people, often volunteers, who are waiting for the invitation to participate. They aren't muscling their way in. They need us to invite them to do what they really want to do. Wonderful.
And they have to be invited in the way that works for them.
For them, right? Not for us. It's so important as a lesson. We had, let me see, a question earlier from Jemima. Thank you, Jemima, who was talking about a timeline for these steps. And I know it might be very particular according to the vision, the organization, and its scale, and what you're attempting to achieve. But do you have kind of a general thought on timeline for these things, and then how to pitch these things across that time span?
Well, the vision, I'm hoping everybody did that little exercise, because then you already have that. That didn't take long at all, but it makes a difference to have a vision and to have a new vision and to think that through. I don't really have a sense of time. I'm sort of start channeling this idea of I'm on my own. How do I build? I just saw somebody put in the chat that they built from being on their own to having a team of 5, which is fantastic. And they were already internal staff. That's great. I was once given this young man when I was working at Youth Radio, and I was like, the last thing he wanted to learn was fundraising. But I said, you know, I'm going to teach you how to fundraise. That's going to be a great skill for you to have. But I said, and what do you want? And he said, I want to be a sports journalist. I got my degree in sports journalism from Howard University. I said, okay, well, I have no idea how I can help you with that, but I'll look out for it. So we had this opportunity from Pew, I think it was Pew Charitable Trust. Was it them? No, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, to fund programs for African-American youth and boys. And it was 2 pages, and it was for $1,000. I said, okay, this is going to be your first grant. I'm going to teach you how to write a grant. It's 2 pages. So he wrote the grant, and by the time they got invited out to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, I was no longer working there. But he told me the story, and he said there were all these, like 100 people from organizations, all getting $1,000. And they read all the names, and everybody's congratulating. They never said Youth Radio. And they were like, oh no, what happened? You know, we got left out. And somebody from the foundation came and said, we'd like you to put in a proposal for $100,000. And in that proposal, he wrote in a little piece where he got to do a sports journalism show. So that's I love that story. But when you have staff that you're sort of given who are not in fundraising, I think that it's really important for them to understand it's a really great skill to have. And, you know, and also, you know, what can we do to help them further their careers in the directions they want to go?
There was something earlier. This is an administrative detail, but it's so important. And Shelley had talked about whether or not you did all the gift entry and admin work as well. I guess this is when you were one person shop.
Yeah.
That's another thing that we can scale, or sometimes, I know it's a dangerous word, but outsource. What are your thoughts on ways to make sure that we have the internal capacity? You know, you talked about it with investing in products and services like Foundation Center, DonorSearch, but what about for skills like this, where you need to go and talk to donors or write a proposal or make a relationship, and but you also have to record that gift. How did you scale that?
It depends on where I was working, you know. So in more recent years where I've been consulting, I'm not doing any of that. But when I was a one-stop development shop, then I was responsible for all of that and for checking it and checking it twice and so on. And this is why when I'm talking about my 5 steps, I'm always talking from the perspective of, I'm assuming you're already maxed out. And then, you know, to ask to do something extra, I'm also aware that you're probably done. You know, you probably had enough. So these are sort of small and incremental steps that you can take to start that expansion. And that's why I said it starts with doing.
Oh, I'm sorry. When you are working as a consultant in that capacity, and you've got a client that's smaller, and you're trying to help them to grow toward that vision, do you tend to lean into the additional hours or hiring coming on the side of raising the funds, or the administrative capacity, or is it a combination of both? I mean, in other words, if they're suddenly going from $100,000 a year to $1 million a year or more, then how do you advise them on having that capacity to record those gifts, send out those thank you notes, and do all the stewardship?
I'm going to tell you a funny story, which is really not answering your question, but I'm just going to tell you the story. So I worked with this organization called Catchlight, and they give fellowships to visual journalists. And they were a $1.2 million organization, and they brought me on, and I said, I think we could add $400,000 this year. And they looked at me very skeptically. And over the space of 3 months, I helped them raise $2.2 million. And so I had set up at the beginning that I would meet once a week with the executive director. She was very good. And then she had a full-time grant writer. And I would meet with them once a week. By month 3, I would get onto the Zoom and she would say, and that was about it. She would say, she was just speechless. Because how do you have a $1.2 million organization have $2.2 million come in 3 months? But that's what happened. And the way that it happened was because they didn't have a vision that they were communicating to their donors. They were saying, we give 30 fellowships a year to photographers. That wasn't the vision. The vision was, we are training visual journalists to work with local news desks in order to expand local news. And there are many, many foundations out there desperately trying to save local news in order to save democracy. That's the vision. And that organization, which is now 2 or 3 years later at $7.8 million and bringing in another 3 million, whatever, you know, but they're now on the radar of the movement to save local news. And so there was some things that I was able to help them out with, which was very basic I wanted her to have everything in one place. I wanted her to be able to see where the money was coming in, where the asks were, what was out, but she didn't have that. Everything was all over the place. The grant writer had some that so streamlining systems is something that I think is really helpful, so that when you are doing that kind of, entering the donor, making sure the thank you notes are going out, that it's at least something that you can do in in an hour a day, or hand it to somebody who's not as high up in the pay scale and the experience. But I find that a lot of people are fundraising in a way that is way too messy to be organized and effective. So to those questions about entering gifts, this is why platforms like DonorSearch or whatever are so valuable, because then you can have everything in one place. Even today, I teach my clients, we're going to have everything in one place. There's only going to be one place to go. All our fundraising is there. I use Google Drive. I worked for Google. I worked for YouTube. So they don't have paper in their offices, if you can imagine. And I figure if it's good enough for Google or YouTube, it's good enough for my clients. Everything is on a Google Drive. Everything is in one place. And we would have thousands of people all working on one spreadsheet. And that's how it needs to be. Sorry, I'm not sure if I asked your question.
No. I think you did. I mean, it's vision first. And then efficiency supports vision.
Yes.
And then if you need to delegate, you find the people to delegate, because you don't want to be spending your time on writing those notes. But if you don't write the notes, you don't have your stewardship. So all those things are of a piece, but there's it's form following function, not the other way around. I know one thing that people have said in sales, and it's not as nearly as elegant as the way you've described it, is that we should sell the benefits, not the features.
Yeah.
And so by talking about the vision, especially what you said with journalism today and the importance of journalism, and there's a lot of funding for nonprofit journalism that speaks to what you just said, not how the newsroom operates, but the function that media plays in society, in civil society. That is exciting. So yeah, I can see why people respond.
Yes.
And I know we had some other things here. Let me see. Any suggestions on building up a team that's inexperienced? So this is a big one that comes up a lot. So you might have people, and these may be volunteers, like board members. They could be volunteers working with you, like the person you mentioned who was making those muffins. Or they might also just be on the staff and they're recent hires, or maybe they recently moved into fundraising from another department. That happens a lot. So how do you work with a team of enthusiastic, perhaps very intelligent, maybe even experienced, but not in development people, and help them to gain the experience and perform the function of development?
Well, one of my mantras is no fundraising without training or support. So I think that nonprofits really always fall into this split between the staff and the board, and especially in smaller organizations. So the staff is resentful at the board because the board is supposed to be raising money, but they're not realizing that the board doesn't actually know what it's doing when it comes to raising money. So the first thing I would do is start training the board. And the board does 1,000 times better when they have some training and some support. So that's a really important thing. So if you're getting somebody who's maybe a secretary who's coming into the fundraising department, then I would start them on with work that they're already skilled at doing, typing things, and but start with things that are completely normal to them. Another thing that I've learned over time is that there are people like me who work with deadlines, and there are people who can't do deadlines. And so they have to have a different kind of work. So maybe they're the ones who do the data entry. Because if I tried to put them on a grant deadline, they'd be, stressed to the max, and they can't do it. So I always like to have a balance of left brain people and right brain people. I think that works really well in fundraising. I love to work with CFOs, because they have a different way of thinking than I do.
Yeah.
I can sort of translate and understand what they're talking about, but it's a good match to have somebody like me who's a visionary with somebody who's in the numbers.
I have to ask you as we begin wrapping up one thing, which is that you've spent a fair amount of time doing lots of kinds of fundraising, and you've talked about all those here. But part of your fundraising, of course, is about film. And in fact, behind your head, there's a picture from the front of your book, which we haven't mentioned. But you have a book on this subject. And one of the reasons I'm mentioning this now, which is right there, getting your film funded. So if anybody's doing film fundraising, or if you have a media department, or if you're trying to fund a podcast or other kind of media, that's probably something you want on your shelf. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because in my limited experience there, they may be like the nonprofit that has sometimes a big vision, but they don't have either the staffing or the constituency. So we have people in the room, for example, at universities, where maybe
Right.
they often do have the vision, the program, and the constituency. Then it's a matter of making all those pieces work and expanding your team, and all this is helpful there. But then there are organizations like a film where they don't have that constituency. They're trying to figure it out. So for you, what's the biggest difference and the biggest similarity between the rest of the nonprofit fundraising in terms of these things and the film fundraising? Are they pretty much the same, or are they totally different, and why?
Gosh, that's a great question that nobody has ever asked me. So I think that the similarities are that the same way as every nonprofit is different and has its own funding mix. And as I said, that as a consultant, I would walk into a nonprofit and they tend to be good in one or two areas, and all the rest, there was nothing. That was very typical, I found. So with filmmakers, I'm always trying to get them to expand the different ways that they raise money, so that they, with my people who are beginners, I always ask them if they would be willing to run a crowdfunding campaign. And it's a great way for people to train. It's the closest thing that I know of to that YMCA 6 weeks campaign that we did. So they get to do a little bit of writing, and they get to do a little bit of pitching, and they get to do a little bit of talking to people about money. And it's a good way to start. So it's always about building on these skills, and then we'll write a grant, and we'll just write a small one, but then we'll do a bigger one. And, so I think that when I do have some filmmakers who are more advanced, and one of my clients, Thomas Allen Harris, is on his maybe 8th feature film. They all open at Sundance. He's a very good fundraiser, but we've still up-leveled his fundraising dramatically, working together. And so I'm always taking people from wherever they are, which might be 0, to, what can we get to 25,000? Can we get to 100,000? Can we get to 500? Right. So it's always, what are the steps? And then I always want to do this sort of, I call it diversifying your portfolio. So we're not just focusing on one type of fundraising. That also gets tiring. Like, do some of this and do some of this and do some of this. Individuals, foundations, write a grant, keep moving back and forth, and that'll keep you fresher as a fundraiser as well.
Thank you. Thank you for all of this. I'm sure there are other questions. In fact, I just saw another one pop up from Jean about boards and vision. So what I will suggest is that, would you share how people can contact you or find out more about you or follow your work, Joanne?
Absolutely. I'm writing my email address.
You're going to put it right in here. And I'll go ahead and take the liberty of reading it for those who are not watching. We're able to read the chat later in the recording, and that is Joanne, that's Joanne with an E, JOANNE, at filmmakersuccess.com. You can find her website there. You can learn about her book on Amazon and probably everywhere else. But I really appreciate your sharing some of this here today, not only for the Sea of Free credit, but for that kind of nuts and bolts experience that you've been sharing, whether we're at small organizations or big ones, to start with vision first. Very, very helpful. Thank you. You can all take a look also for a link directly in the chat. And before everybody goes, I want to let you know that We have a session coming up with Craig Shelley of the OR Group on top trends in philanthropy this Thursday. I hope you'll join us for that at 3:30. And also next week, we will not be back until the 9th. I'll be in Japan. I'll be hosting directly from there. So I hope you'll join us for that first session on May 9th. That'll be at 4:30 p.m. because it's 5:30 in the morning in Japan, but I'll be up bright and early and looking forward to seeing all of you to discuss with a bunch of our North American friends in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community about the importance of that community in philanthropy. It's way beyond muffins. The muffins are important.
Muffins
And
are
so I hope you'll come and join us for a really, really wonderful, rich, and informative conversation, which should include you, like the rest of this series, like the people like Joanne. Really do appreciate you. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Joanne, so much for sharing today. We'll look forward to seeing you all next time. Till then, take care.
Thanks everyone for your questions. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne.